library is open. Okay, so now we're gonna scoot a little forward and we're gonna talk a little more history. And that was for the music halls and vaudeville. Now, behind me is a picture of someone very special. Very, very special. Because you see, this is the late 19th century, early 20th century. Music halls and vaudeville was huge. At this time, too, if you're ever in New York and you've seen a Broadway show, this is when Broadway was down on 34th Street. Huge vaudevillian houses full of acts. Vaudeville at the time, there weren't really scripts, but there was a series of scenes that would happen. And people like Fanny Brice became very famous, later to make Streisand very famous, darling. And now this gentleman behind me, and this is him in both forms, Julian Eltinge. Julian Eltinge was a prominent, very, very famous female impersonator. He started in vaudeville, and this is one of his vaudeville characters. This is him in his male sense, and this is him in his, wait, let me get out of the way. That's him in his lady sense. And people were completely convinced that he was a woman. But when he was off stage, he took on this hyper-masculine character to make people think that he was not homosexual because, of course, it was against the law and he had to be very careful. He was apparently never married. He was seen with women, and there are no personal stories of them. Well, there were no phones back then, were there? No one was recording and putting him on TikTok. But he was very famous. He ended up doing Hollywood movies. He toured the country with very famous shows, and he was one of the biggest stars. And in fact, there was a Broadway theater named after him up on 42nd Street, which, if you're in New York City, they took the theater because they wanted to save it. They put it up on stilts. They put it on a machine, moved it down the block, and if you've ever been in New York on 42nd Street, the AMC Theater Complex is actually the old Eltine Theater. Eltine, I keep mispronouncing his words. Eltinge. The Eltinge Theater is now part of the AMC movie theater, so when you go into AMC, that's part of his marvelous theater named after one of the most famous drag queens of all time. I mean, that was really quite something. Oh yes, vaudeville, darling, vaudeville. And those vaudeville stars ended up, after vaudeville sort of waned out later on, many of them didn't have jobs anymore, and they worked in some of the clubs. There was a club called Sammy's downtown, which was considered the poor man's store club in New York City, where all of the ex-vaudevillian people, including the female impersonators, would go and work for tips for years and years, all through the 60s and 70s even. Yes, quite wonderful. In fact, in my building here in New York, I live where a lot of artists live, and we had a lady named Doris. Yes, the same as me, darling. She grew up backstage at vaudeville. Her parents were very famous vaudevillians, and she grew up, and her parents were in the Ziegfeld Follies, and she used to entertain me by telling me great stories of the days of the Follies and sitting backstage during vaudeville time. A marvelous time, marvelous. And let's not forget this wonderful man.